The tension in Trump Tower's boardroom was unlike anything the advisors had ever seen. This wasn't a political debate, a business meeting, or even a campaign strategy session. This was personal. This was Donald Trump versus Barron Trump, father and son, locked in a heated clash of ideologies, fighting not just for the future of their relationship, but perhaps even for the future of America itself. Donald Trump, seated at the head of the long mahogany table, exuded his signature dominance. Dressed in a navy blue suit and his famous red tie, he leaned back in his chair, studying his son, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. Across from him, Barron Trump sat with perfect posture, his hands clasped together, his expression unreadable. Unlike his father, he wasn't relying on sheer presence to command the room. He relied on something even more dangerous: conviction. The advisors around the room were unusually still. Some exchanged nervous glances, others pretended to look at their notes. They all knew, when Donald Trump was challenged, he fought back. But this time was different, because this time, it was his own son sitting across from him, and Barron Trump was not backing down. Donald Trump broke the silence first. "All right, kid," he said, his voice controlled but firm, like a general addressing a young soldier. "Let's hear it. You've got a lot to say, huh?" Barron didn't flinch. "I do," he said, his voice steady, measured. Trump smirked slightly, leaning forward. "All right, let's hear it. What's on your mind?" Barron took a deep breath. "America's changing, Dad," he said simply. Trump's smirk faded just slightly. "And?" he asked. Barron leaned in slightly. "And if you don't change with it, you're going to lose them." A beat of silence. Someone at the far end of the table inhaled sharply. Trump's fingers stopped tapping. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Lose who?" he asked. Barron met his gaze. "The people who got you here," Barron said. "The ones who believed in you, the ones who trusted you." Trump tilted his head slightly, as if measuring the words carefully. "I still have them," he said simply. "I still have more support than anyone else in this country." Barron nodded. "For now," he said. The room shifted. That wasn't just a response. That was a warning. Trump's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained even. "You think you understand this game?" he asked. Barron held his father's gaze. "I understand the people playing it," he replied. Trump scoffed. "Oh yeah? And what do you think people want, huh? You think they want me to start acting like one of these weak, apologizing politicians?" Barron shook his head. "They don't want you to apologize." Trump raised an eyebrow. Barron leaned in. "They want you to listen." The advisors stiffened in their chairs. This was dangerous territory. Trump sat back, crossing his arms. "I listen plenty," he said, his tone more defensive now. Barron shook his head again. "No, Dad. You talk. You dominate. You control. But you don't listen anymore." A long pause. The air in the room felt thicker now. Trump narrowed his eyes. "I listen," he repeated. "I listen to the people who matter." Barron's lips pressed into a firm line. "And that's exactly the problem," he said. "You think some people matter more than others." Trump's nostrils flared slightly. He leaned forward. "That's called being a leader, kid." Barron didn't blink. "That's called picking favorites." A sharp intake of breath came from one of the advisors. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was a reckoning. Trump exhaled sharply, shaking his head, muttering under his breath. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You think because you've been to a few fancy schools and read a few books, you know more than me?" Barron shook his head. "No," he said, "but I know what people feel. And right now, they feel like they don't matter." Trump froze for half a second. It was subtle, but Barron caught it, and that's when he knew. He had gotten through, at least a little. Barron leaned in. "You got elected because people believed in you," he said. "You made them feel like they had a voice." Trump watched him carefully now, like an opponent he hadn't quite figured out yet. "But now," Barron continued, "they feel like just another crowd at another rally." Trump's expression hardened. "I built this movement," he said. "I know," Barron replied. Trump's jaw tightened. "No, I mean I built it. From the ground up. I didn't inherit it. I didn't have it handed to me. I fought for it." Barron met his gaze. Then act like it. Another stunning silence. A couple of the advisors looked down at their notes, pretending not to exist. One of them, a senior strategist, actually looked nervous. Trump exhaled, rubbing his hands together, as if trying to calm his temper. "All right," he said, nodding. "All right, let's hear it then. Since you've got all the answers, what should I do, huh? What's your big idea?" Barron hesitated for the first time. Because this wasn't just talk anymore. His father had just called him out, and now he had to back it up. The silence in the Trump Tower boardroom lingered long after Donald Trump's words faded. Barron remained seated, his posture straight and composed, while his father stood near the door, his hand still gripping the handle. For the first time in this entire exchange, Donald Trump hesitated. It was subtle, so subtle that no one else in the room might have noticed it. But Barron did. The advisors sat frozen, their eyes bouncing between the President of the United States and his youngest son, unsure if they were witnessing the start of something monumental or something catastrophic. Trump let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. "You think you have it all figured out, huh?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but still carrying that familiar gravelly authority. Barron, still steady, leaned forward just slightly. "No," he said plainly, "but I think I see something that you don't." Trump's brow twitched as if he was holding back a response. Instead, he let out a short chuckle, one of those laughs he used when he was calculating. Not amused. "And what's that, kid?" Barron met his father's stare without flinching. "You're afraid," he said simply, a sharp intake of breath from one of the advisors, and another stiffened in his chair. Donald Trump froze. The air in the room shifted instantly. Trump's jaw clenched, and for a moment, everything stopped. Then he let out another chuckle, but this time, it was harsher. "Afraid?" he repeated as if the word was offensive to him. "You think I'm afraid?" Barron nodded, still calm. "Yeah," he said. "Not of losing, though." Trump's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't speak. "You're afraid of being irrelevant," Barron continued, "of becoming what you used to fight against." A murmur went through the room. One of the older advisors shook his head slightly, as if this was going too far. But Trump didn't move. His fingers tightened slightly around the door handle, his breathing a little heavier now. Barron leaned back in his chair, studying his father. "Back in 2016, people saw you as an outsider," Barron said. "A disruptor, someone who wasn't part of the machine." Trump's eyes flickered, but he didn't interrupt. Barron continued. "But now," he tilted his head slightly, "now you've been in it too long. Now people are starting to wonder if you're just another part of the system." Trump finally moved, stepping back toward the table. His advisors visibly tensed. "You're saying I'm part of the swamp now?" Trump asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Barron didn't hesitate. "I'm saying people might start to believe you are," he said, "and that's worse." Trump's fingers drummed against the table now, the same way they always did when he was thinking, when he was measuring his next move. "And what do you suggest I do then?" he asked. Barron didn't blink. "Prove to them that you're still fighting for them," he said, "not for yourself." Trump smirked. "That's what I've been doing." Barron shook his head. "No," he said, "you've been fighting because you don't like losing. That's different." A murmur from one of the strategists. The tension tightened in the room. Trump took a slow breath, rubbing his hand over his jaw. Then he stepped even closer, planting his hands on the table. "Let me ask you something, Barron," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "If you were in my shoes, what would you do?" "Huh? Since you're so smart, since you seem to think you know the pulse of America better than I do, tell me, what's your plan?" Barron paused for just a second, gathering his thoughts. Then he stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, unshaken. "You want to win?" Barron asked. "You need to stop running the same playbook." Trump raised an eyebrow. "Is that right?" Barron nodded. "You keep talking about the past," he said. "What you built, what you did, how great it was." Trump watched him carefully, saying nothing. "But people don't want to hear about what you did," Barron continued. "They want to know what you're going to do next." A pause, then Trump let out a short, sharp laugh. "So you want me to reinvent myself?" he asked. "You think that's the answer?" Barron gave a small shrug. "No," he said. "I think you need to stop worrying about your legacy and start worrying about their lives." That sentence hit like a brick. The air went completely still. Even Trump didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened again, but this time, it wasn't anger. It was something else, something closer to realization. Barron took a step closer. "This isn't about you anymore, Dad," he said. "It's about them. And if you don't make them believe that, then yeah, you're going to lose." The room was silent. Finally, Trump exhaled sharply and shook his head. "This is a waste of time," he muttered. "I have real work to do." Barron didn't stop him. He simply nodded. Trump turned to leave. But just before he stepped out, he hesitated again. Without turning back, he spoke. "You think you're so smart," he said. Barron smiled faintly. "I think I see things differently than you," he corrected. Trump finally glanced over his shoulder. "Maybe that's not a bad thing," he muttered. Then he was gone. The advisors, still frozen, barely dared to breathe. Barron simply adjusted his suit jacket, exhaled, and walked toward the door. As he exited, a senior strategist leaned toward another advisor and whispered, "Did we just watch history happen?" The other advisor nodded slowly. "I think we did." Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below.